To do during these few minutes is to briefly go over some of the fundamental concepts in my work in language acquisition. I'm going to divide the presentation into three unequal parts. First, our theoretical work, and I'll be going through four basic hypotheses about language acquisition. Then I'll be talking briefly about the application, and today I'll be focusing mostly on the elementary level, beginning level language class. And finally, I'll take a few minutes and discuss why, even though I think the theory is correct, even though the theory has proved very fruitful, there are difficulties in applying it. And I'll say that some of the difficulties come from our students and some of them come from us. To the theory. The theory begins, the cornerstone of the theory is a hypothesis that we've called the acquisition learning hypothesis. It says that we have two very different ways of going about the job of getting better in another language. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're very different. Acquisition I've described as a subconscious process. And subconscious really means two things. It means, first of all, while you're acquiring, you don't always know you're acquiring. It goes on below your level of awareness. For example, you're reading a book, you're listening to a conversation, you're listening to a presentation such as this one. You are, of course, listening to the presentation, you are reading the book, but without realizing it at the same time, you might be acquiring. Second, once you're finished acquiring, you're not always aware that anything has happened. A good demonstration of this is the universal experience we've had of hearing someone make a mistake in our own language. Now, when you hear someone make a mistake in your own language, very rarely can you tell exactly what rule was broken. When I hear someone make a mistake in English, for example, my first language, most of the time I can tell what rule was broken. I have a PhD in linguistics, in grammar, in fact, which some people find a strange thing to have studied. But even despite all this training in grammar, I can't always tell exactly what rule was broken. Instead, I have a feeling that something is wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it. That feeling for correctness, that feeling for language, is what we call language acquisition. We think everyone can acquire language. Everyone can pick up language subconsciously. Children acquire their first languages. Children acquire second languages. Adults acquire language. The ability to subconsciously pick up language does not disappear when you enter school. It does not disappear when you become a teenager. It doesn't disappear when you get older. It's with us forever. We think the language acquisition device never shuts off. Very different from acquisition is what we call learning. That's what most of us did in school. Learning is knowing about language, conscious knowledge of language. In English public schools, for example, we learn that a noun is the name of a person, place, thing, or idea. We learn that the subject and the verb are supposed to agree. This is conscious language learning. Language acquisition and language learning are very, very different. In fact, I think very different psychological processes are involved. Of the two, acquisition and learning, the research has been telling me that acquisition is far more important. Here's how we think they interrelate. When you're about to say something in another language, and it's easy to see in a language you don't speak very well, if you can put yourself in that position. When you come out with a sentence easily, it comes from what you've acquired, not from what you've learned. All the rules that you learned in school do only one thing for you. They act as a monitor or an editor. So let's say you've learned a little French in school, you speak French as a low intermediate, you're about to have a conversation in French. The sentence you're about to say pops into your mind from your subconscious somewhere. Then just before you say it, the theory says you scan it, you look at it, you inspect it, you think of the rules you learned in school, and you make corrections. This isn't, I should emphasize, not simply an idea that came from the ivory tower. It's based on research, and the evidence for it is in technical books and journals in the professional literature, but also happens to correspond with the intuitions that many people have about what happens to them when they try to speak other languages. Rather than go through all the research now, what I prefer to do is talk immediately a little about the pedagogy, what went through my mind 11 years ago when I first thought of this idea that there are these two processes and they're related in this certain way. My original idea was this, and I thought it was good common sense. Acquisition gives us our fluency. Learning gives us our accuracy. It's an attractive idea. We have two components. They make two very different kinds of contributions. Clearly, we want both. We want language students to speak easily and fluently, but we also want the grammar to be there. We don't want a grammarless pigeon. So what I thought then is, what we need is a balanced program. 2 days a week acquisition, 2 days a week learning. 2 days a week conversation, 2 days a week grammar. Now, that sounds very fair. The truth must be somewhere in the middle. It has intuitive appeal. Unfortunately, it's wrong. In fact, it's all wrong. What the research has been telling me for the last 10 plus years, no matter where you turn, no matter where you look, the important role is with acquisition. Acquisition gives us fluency and accuracy. For the adult, for the analytic thinking, grammar-loving adult, it's at least 95% acquisition, possibly more. For the child, it's 100%. And I'd also like to admit this to you. No one was more disappointed to discover this than me. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this discussion, my graduate work was in grammar. My PhD is in grammar. Like many language teachers today, I love grammar. My life used to revolve around grammar. My best friends are grammarians. I love to discuss relative clauses. The problem is that that's not how language acquisition happens. Language acquisition does not happen by learning grammar rules, by memorizing vocabulary lists. This leads then to our major point. If acquisition is more important than learning, we must ask how it happens. How do we help people acquire language? This is, of course, the major theoretical point for the universities, and it's also the major pedagogical point. If acquisition is more important than learning, that's what we want to have happen in our classrooms. Let me begin this discussion by making what may appear to be an outrageous claim. I think we all acquire language in exactly the same way. The reason this is an outrageous thing to say is that these days in education, as many of you have undoubtedly noticed, we're living in an age of individual variation. We're very concerned with how our students are different, not how our students are the same. We're concerned about individual variation in cognitive style and learning style, which side of the brain people are using, etc. And there's a lot of very good research on individual variation. Nevertheless, there are some things we all do the same, and language is one of them. It's as fundamental, as universal, as breathing, as eating, as walking. We all do it, and we all acquire it the same way. The way we acquire language is amazingly simple. We acquire language when we understand messages. When people speak to us in another language and we understand what they say, or we read something in another language and we understand the message, language acquisition will take place. In fact, it's an amazing thing. Language acquisition takes place necessarily. It's unavoidable. You can't help it. Given messages people understand, what we call comprehensible input, the language acquisition device goes to work. It happens subconsciously, automatically, and inevitably. Some of you will recognize some of these ideas from Chomsky's philosophizing, especially from his book Reflections on Language. My contribution to the Chomskyan way of thinking is to claim that not only is there a language acquisition that works in children, but it works for second languages as well. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, it doesn't degenerate. Its function is full till the end of our lives. Okay, so we acquire language when we understand it. This major idea of comprehensible input has two corollaries. One corollary has to do with speaking. Talking is not practicing. The ability to speak another language is a result of acquiring it, not its cause. For example, if you want to improve your English, it will not help you to speak English to yourself as you drive to work in the morning in your car. If you want to improve your French, it will not help you to close the bathroom door and speak French to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I'm convinced they don't. The ability to speak a language is a result of getting language acquisition, not its cause. In fact, You can look at your own experience to see that this is so. If you've ever been a student in a language class, you can see this. If you give adults comprehensible input, if they understand the messages, in a good language class, after a week or two, 10, 15 hours on the average, my experience has been that talking simply comes. It emerges on its own. You literally can't hold it back unless there's some kind of block, which we'll talk about later. Again, evidence for this is all over the theoretical literature, in my opinion. Many of us have had practical experiences which demonstrate that it's so as well. Children who come to countries, immigrant children, for example, limited English proficient students in the United States, for example, typically when they arrive, they don't start speaking right away. There's usually a period of several months until they start talking. What we typically see then, when children do start to speak, is that their speech follows a certain natural development in language acquisition. Certain things come early, certain things tend to come in the middle, certain things come later. And after a year or so, they're typically, if they're in an input-rich situation, speaking fairly well. When they start to speak, it's not the beginning of their language acquisition. When they start to speak, it's the result of the comprehensible input they've gotten over the few months of what we call their silent period. Another corollary of this important idea of comprehensible input has to do with the kind of input we present to people. We have in language classes the principle of grammatical sequencing. We're all familiar with this. For example, in our first week of language class, everything is in the present tense. We can only talk about objects in the room, what we're doing at this time, at this moment in class. Suddenly, at the end of the first month, we become obsessed with the past. We can only talk about last week and last year. Eventually, the third month, you can only talk about the future. What will you do when you finish school, etc. We call this grammatical sequencing, and its goal is to aid in the acquisition of grammar. The theory says it has exactly the opposite impact. The major sub-hypothesis says that if we give people comprehensible input, and we give them a lot of it, grammatical sequencing is not only not necessary, it's probably harmful. Let me repeat that a major goal of language class is not just to bring about grammatical fluency in students, it's also to get the maximum level of grammatical accuracy. My position is that the way to do this is to give students a great deal of comprehensible input. They'll produce both fluency and accuracy. The theory says that if enough input is present, if there's a rich source of comprehensible input, all the rules that the students are ready to acquire, examples of all these rules will be there in the input. If you compare, I think that grammatical sequencing has insurmountable problems that comprehensible input handles with ease. Let me just give you the feeling for a couple of these problems. Let's say you're taking a standard language class. Say it's French, and it's at the beginning level. And today is past tense day. Today's the day we're going to review the past tense. And you're absent. You're sick. You can't come to class. Something's wrong. Well, the way we currently teach language, it's too bad. You've missed the past tense. You've got to wait till next year when we go through the whole language syllabus again. With comprehensible input, that's not a problem. If you miss class one day, don't worry. Come back tomorrow. You'll hear more comprehensible input. You'll hear more of the rule that you happen to be ready for, no matter what that rule is. You'll see it in the readings. It's the same idea as the well-balanced diet as compared to single doses of individual vitamins. We have a much better chance of supplying the student exactly what he or she needs. Probably the worst problem, though, with the grammatical syllabus is that it's boring.